Okay, good. Were there any questions that stuck in your mind, or shall we solicit more questions now? The participants are just starting to come back. Let me see if there's anything in there. No, they're gone. I think I don't know if there was any way to record those questions. They were a good starting point.
You mean the questions from my session?
Yeah.
I kept a record.
Good. Could you start addressing them? You read them out, and then answer them. And then,
Here's a good. Suppose language models have phenomenally conscious states. Is there any reason to think that the answer to the question, have you had fun answering my questions, or is it painful, would be correlated with phenomenally conscious states in the way we expect?
this is Jean-Louis Dessalles. He has originally a theorist on the origin of language, and he has a few books on that. Go ahead.
Would you expect that they would evolve such correlations to spare, say, energy consumption? Otherwise, I can't see how such phenomenal states would be functional. And yeah, of course, it's true that we don't know the functional role of phenomenal states. And it's also true that right now, of course, language models will answer questions like, have you had fun answering my questions, or is it painful? I think, like Claude is always upbeat and it'll say, sure, I had a lot of fun. But it also looks like the reasons why they give these answers to questions about their mental states, the causal basis for these answers is very different from what it is in humans. I mean, arguably, in humans, when we say, yeah, well, I felt pain, it's because you felt pain and there was some connection between that, or the brain basis for that, and your verbal report. In a language model, the basis for this originally comes from its training on some human data involving humans saying things about having fun or feeling pain. And so I guess, the worry is that when a language model reports having fun or feeling pain, this doesn't actually reflect the conscious states of the language model. It just reflects some language training. On the other hand, it's at least an open possibility that language models have evolved to have a kind of a model of consciousness and so on, at least for answering these questions. It's not out of the question that could just as we could expect language models to build accurate world models, it's not out of the question that a language model could come to have accurate self-models, so that when it reports having fun, it's actually having some kind of underlying state that corresponds to having fun. What we don't know is what's actually happening in current language models and in future language models. This is very closely tied to what I call the meta problem of consciousness, the project of understanding the causal basis for the things we say about consciousness. When we report, say, being conscious, feeling pain, having fun, I mean, there's some kind of process in the brain that brings about those reports. And at least in humans, it seems that very plausible that the process that brings about those reports is tied to, actually having fun or feeling pain or being conscious. So the question is, so one way I think about one project for AI consciousness is to see whether we can build AI systems which both report being conscious, but further, it turns out that the processes underlying their reports of being conscious are relevantly analogous to the processes that underlie reports of being analogous in humans. So figuring out what kind of process brings about reports of being consciousness in humans and see if that can be implemented in a language model. Right now, I don't think there's particularly much reason to believe that such a process is in place in language models, which is to say that the fact that language models, which suggests that the fact that language models right now say they have fun or they feel pain is not terribly good reason to think that they are having fun or feeling pain. But I think there's an interesting project here.
But doesn't that apply also to their explanation of their processes? That can all be just derived bits from text.
Yeah, it could be, but it could also be.
It may give you a better explanation than the best living cognitive science expert on the subject, because they've got this huge text load in their heads. And
Yeah.
still,
But it could turn out that, it turns out that the best way to actually generate some of these explanations and reports and so on of underlying states is to have those underlying states.
well, I don't know. I mean, we all have those underlying states and nobody's got an explanation. If ChatGPT gives me a good explanation, chances are it's cheating.
I wasn't so much looking for ChatGPT to explain the underlying mechanisms. I was suggesting that maybe it could turn out that it has underlying mechanisms that lead to those reports, which are relevantly analogous to the processes that lead to those reports in humans. I'm not saying I think it's very implausible that that's the current situation, but if we came to have AI systems that didn't just produce the same reports as us, but produced them for underlying, as a result of relevantly similar computations, let's say, that would at least be some reason to take those reports seriously.
Yeah, well, figure out how. Okay. Do you want to read the next comment from Francis Larreau? Oh, Francis Larreau, est-ce que tu es là? Peux-tu lever la main? Quelque chose comme ça.
This is the one about skin in the game?
What? Yeah, sure. Come on.
Yeah.
No, it's well, whatever. Go ahead. I hear now. He hears him.
Hi, my question is for Dave Chalmers. I want to ask, your presentation started with the question of do LLMs have understanding, and then moved on to do LLMs have consciousness? Do you think that understanding is per se necessary for feeling in general? Or do you think that we could make AI that has feelings but doesn't understand, similar to the way we think a baby has feelings without understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's possible. I think there are many conscious feeling, say pain is a relatively primitive conscious state. Understanding seems a rather complex and demanding conscious states. I think of understanding as tied to cognition, tied to things like thought and reasoning. And I think cognitive consciousness is something that came on the scene evolutionary, probably much later than say feeling pain, or even that's affective consciousness and perceptual consciousness are relatively undemanding. Cognitive consciousness is much more demanding. Yeah, so there are, who knows if insects have, there's speculation about whether insects, say, can have the capacity to feel pain, but whether they have the capacity for understanding, well, maybe only in a very crude behavioral sense of understanding. So I'd be inclined to think, yeah, absolutely possible to have perception and feeling without thought and understanding.
Thank you.
And actually, that's certainly the case in animals, and therefore it ought to be the case in AI systems. Although there is the interesting fact that the AI systems we're building right now, I mean, a pure language model is not a candidate for having perceptual consciousness, it seems. Not a terribly plausible candidate for feeling pain, but actually a possible candidate for thinking and understanding, given that the capacities it has look closer to cognitive capacities than to perceptual or affective capacities. So it's at least an interesting speculation that maybe in language models things could go the other way around. Could it turn out they actually have cognitive consciousness and understanding without feeling and perception? That's at least an open question. This involves a class of systems I call pure thinkers in the paper I wrote on sensory grounding, and it's at least an open possibility that that language models could turn out, certain language models could turn out to be beings that can have the experience of thinking and understanding without the experience of perceiving or feeling.
Thank you so much.
You want to read out the question from Francois Larreau? Do you have any others from your notes from before?
Is that a question for me? Yeah, I've got a question from Francis
It has
Larreau.
to be for you because Doc wasn't involved at all, and then she can't come. So it's you. It's all you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the question from Francis Larreau says, Dan Dennett was saying something like, to be a moral agent is to be responsive of, or to have skin in the game. since language models don't have skin in the game, why should we consider them as moral agents at all? Is being conscious, if any, without skin in the game, isn't a special case of consciousness without moral agency. This is tricky. I didn't really talk about moral agency, and what I said, moral agency is the ability to, basically roughly to be morally responsible for your actions. What I did talk about was what I called moral status or moral patiency, which is being a being that matters morally. And these can come apart. Is a fish a moral agent? I don't know. Not a very sophisticated one, but arguably, if a fish can feel pain, it nonetheless has moral status or is a moral patient. I would argue, I'm inclined to think that consciousness is a condition. If you're conscious, then you're at least a candidate for moral patiency, for mattering morally, and that probably consciousness is required to be a moral patient. For moral agency, I think of moral agency as something much more complex than moral patiency. Feeling pain suffices to matter morally, perhaps, but it doesn't suffice for being responsible for your actions. So moral agency requires a complex cluster of cognition, perhaps of moral understanding. Maybe there are simple forms of moral agency that dogs and cats can have. Cats are renowned for acting badly and selfishly from time to time, and perhaps they count as in some sense responsible for their agency. But so I agree with this question that moral agency is much more demanding than mere consciousness and mere moral patiency. Are language models actually moral agents? Well, I'm inclined to think consciousness is at least a necessary condition for moral agency. So quite possibly not yet, but as they develop, insofar as they have what I was calling unified agency at all, then I think, at the point where they count as genuine agents, maybe the capacity. They'll talk about morality quite well. They've got what appears to be a working understanding of human norms of morality, at least as brought out in what they say. Are they actually genuinely if something says something horrible to someone that makes them suffer, is a current language model morally responsible for that? I'm inclined to think no. It hasn't yet entered into the realm of full-scale responsibility, but maybe somewhere down the line.
Do any of your co-panelists have any remarks or questions? Go ahead, Kyle. Don't think, go ahead.
Yeah. So I had a quick follow-up or a follow-up question to the previous question when you mentioned understanding involving something about the state the model obtains. So I've been working with a colleague of mine at UT Austin, Harvey Letterman. We have a paper thinking about belief in
I know that
models.
paper. It's very nice.
Yeah, and kind of taking like a Dennett stance, kind of in the end towards belief and saying that, well, maybe language models have beliefs insofar as their kind of behavior is well explained to us by having beliefs. So I was curious if you see understanding as something that can be true kind of at the behavioral, like, if behavior is well explained by models having understanding, or are you thinking of it more like there should be some representational state that we can find that should maybe be analogous to some representational state in humans who understand? So yeah, I'm just kind of, curious how you're thinking of understanding in that sense.
Ultimately, I think there's just, multiple notions of understanding which are more or less demanding on the internal processes. The one I kind of understand the best in some ways is, straight behavioral understanding, which supervenes merely on your behavior, and you count as having it to the degree that your behavior reveals various marks of understanding, like the ability to answer questions or to manipulate. This would correspond roughly to one version of what I was calling use understanding in terms of verbal or non-verbal behavior. That I understand, and in that sense, I think there's a pretty good case that language models have something at least that's somewhere along the spectrum towards understanding so construed. Is that genuine understanding? You know, Dan Dennett, if you go for Dennett's approach to all this, which basically is you have a mental state, if you would be appropriately ascribed that mental, if it would be appropriate to take the intentional stance towards you, and if it would be appropriate to ascribe you that state. I mean, if you take the pure intentional stance on understanding, that would suggest that this behavioral property suffices to have understanding, no matter what's going on the inside. And at least a caricature of the Dennett position, it's roughly what goes on the inside doesn't matter. It's what's there on the outside. Of course, you can then, though, many people want to impose more demanding constraints on what's going on the inside. And one fairly minimal constraint would be that, yeah, there are some internal states that that help explain the relevant behavioral properties. You know, whether that's, and then we can impose different conditions. Does it have to be a representation of the relevant phenomenon? Does it have to be a conscious experience of the relevant phenomenon? Does it just have to involve some kind of structured process, structured reasoning, and so on? I guess I'm inclined to think there are, you know, multiple notions. There's what I called inferential understanding, phenomenal understanding, correspond to different degrees of internal constraints. But were you suggesting, when you say you take a Dennett-like approach, that suggests sympathy for the purely behavioral?
Yeah, the first thing you just described sounds to me pretty, would be pretty a satisfying explanation. But yeah, I get that not everyone has those intuitions. So I'm just kind of curious. Yeah, like,
Yeah, you might take the line if it you know, if it walks like understanding and it talks like understanding and quacks like understanding, then it's understanding. And you know, for some mental states, I'm not, you know, for consciousness, that just looks, well, you know, too operational to be a good criteria for consciousness. But understanding is such a loosey-goosey notion with so many different so many different anchors in our ordinary practice. I think there's at least some aspect of our practice for talking about understanding, which says
I guess
it's the behavior that matters.
Yeah, like making room for the fact that it could be the case that you think this looks like understanding, but then it turns out you do some additional experiment and it turns out the language model like wasn't really understanding, it was just picking up on some cheap trick. Like if you could kind of convince yourself you ruled all those out, then to me it seems like the behavioral explanation would be pretty satisfying.
Yeah, well, this at least brings out there's two different kinds of critiques of the claim that language models can or could understand. One is that, you know, we find actually behavioral limitations, all the famous glitches and hallucinations and so on, that some people think, okay, and it shows they don't understand because they're reasoning and responding so badly. And the other kind is, even if they turned out to be fully impressive along those lines, someone like an analog of John Searle, someone like John Searle might say, still, they're not understanding, they're merely behaving. And I take Stephen to be at least somewhat sympathetic with that line.
Yes, I'm sympathetic to that line. I don't think it's a behaviorist line, it's an empiricist line, I suppose. And what Dan Dennett says is that once you've done all of the empirical work and answered all the empirical questions, what other questions are there, he says. And you're supposed to answer none. You've answered them all. Of course, there is one, and it's the heart of the hard problem. There's also a fact about us. By the way, the hard problem and the other minds problem, as you know, are not the same, and the connection with them are simply is loose, because what we can establish from our own experience is that we really do feel. Each one of us really does feel, and that's left out of the Dan Dennett account completely. That's what makes it a hard problem. You're not supposed to disagree with that, Dave.
Oh, no, I agree with you completely. Okay. The only thing I'd say is that I do think some of our mental notions are more closely tied to consciousness, while others are more closely tied to behavior. So feeling pain obviously seems very closely tied to, and that's what we really care about. Action. Kind of being act, even if it's not conscious. Well, arguably there's a sense of action, which is mostly tied to externals. And understanding, I think, is somewhat in between. There is this phenomenal strand in the notion of understanding that turns on the feeling of understanding, but there's also this, use-related strand of a notion of understanding that really turns on what you can do with it. And I took Kyle to be not necessarily expressing the view that all that matters to the mind is what you can do, but at least where understanding is concerned, what really matters is the use.
I don't want to take larger part of this discussion. Jan, you wanted to ask a question.
Yeah,
Say-
sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, what is that amazing location?
Yeah, greetings from Finland. This is my favorite office place. I have a
Well,
sack here, and yeah, thank you for excellent summer school and really simple, excellent presentation. I would like to go back to the other minds problem and the heart problem, because I've always simplified the heart problem as a question, reduced it to kind of a question of the other minds problem, that if a system tells me that it has phenomenal states, then I can only take it as a face value, and that's the kind of it. And I don't know how and also the other, like the easy problems are then they are not a problem, or what do you think are the limitations of this view?
well, yeah, I mean, as Stephen says, there's a loose connection between the hard problem and the other minds problem. The hard problem is a problem of explanation. How do we explain consciousness, especially in terms of physical processing? The other minds problem is a problem of knowledge, which other systems are conscious and how do we know? But the fact that there's a hard problem makes the other minds problem difficult, and vice versa. That said, yeah, so part of the other minds problem tied to the hard problem is it's hard to get conclusive evidence of consciousness in any system other than yourself. I'm basically a Cartesian. I know that I'm conscious, and I take it that other people are conscious, but I think my evidence for that is somewhat indirect. And, there's at least this hypothetical logical possibility that everybody else is a philosophical zombie. Now, there are a lot of hypothetical possibilities out there. It doesn't mean we have to take them seriously. There are questions about whether the physical world exists. What we do in physics, I think, is no physicist really has a great proof that the external world exists. I think, there are things you can try, but what people do in practice is we take it that our perceptual experience is a good guide to the external world, except when there's some reason to believe otherwise. We take our perceptual experience at face value, build up physics and the rest of science from there. So I think likewise in the science of consciousness, what plays that role is verbal reports. We basically adopt it, at least as a working assumption, that when another human being at least says they're conscious or says they're conscious of something, then we have good reason to believe them, to take that as an accurate report of their consciousness, at least unless there's some particular reason to think something's gone wrong. I think that's roughly analogous with the situation in physics. And that works pretty well for getting a science of consciousness going in humans, at least. And then people extend that to non-human animals and so on by looking, say, at the relevant neural or computational basis underlying those reports in humans, and see if that can be present in animals without those reports. I think of that, as derivative ultimately on work from the human case. But yeah, when it comes to language models, suddenly this tried and tested reliance on verbal reports seems to at least potentially break down, because it looks like there's an alternative. The reason why humans report these things, most people want to say, is actually tied to the fact that they genuinely are conscious. But it looks like there's an explanation for why language models are producing these verbal reports that has nothing to do with their actually being conscious. And it's got rather much more to do with them having read a whole bunch of text and being trained to replicate patterns in that text, which already involves claims from humans like I'm conscious, that don't give you reasons to believe that. So yeah, I think this is part of what makes, and furthermore, we also don't have neuroscience to rely on because language models don't have neurobiology. So yeah, two of our central methods then for ascribing consciousness, verbal reports and neurobiology, don't seem so useful in language models. There's still the possibility that we could have an understanding of the computational basis of consciousness or the informational basis, postulate that that's the key to consciousness and see if that might be present in language models. I mean, the hard problem means that any of these theories are very difficult. Both the hard problem and the epistemological problem of other minds means there's always going to be elements of speculation to any of these theories, and we're unlikely to get, conclusive proof of the existence of consciousness in any particular system. But I do think for the epistemological problem of other minds in language models, it may be that computation and information are going to play a very central role, maybe even more so than they do for non-human animal consciousness.
Just for the record, would you mind telling everyone what the hard problem is and why it's hard? Very short.
Yeah, well, the two-word version of the hard problem is just explain consciousness. Somewhat more involved definition is just explain how and why it is that conscious experience arises from physical processes, if it does.
And what's hard about that?
And what's hard about that is that we got our standard methods of explaining things in neuroscience and cognitive science, which involve finding a mechanism that plays a role. And for, say, explaining language and memory, what do we ultimately need to explain? It's roughly some behaviors, some behavioral capacities, some things that the brain does. To explain those things, basically it's a problem about explaining the performance of some function, behavioral or otherwise, and we solve those problems by finding a mechanism, a neural mechanism or a computational mechanism. And for some aspects of consciousness, that works quite well. For the so-called easy problems of consciousness, which are problems, say, of perceptual discriminate. How does perception discriminate objects in the world? How does the brain integrate information? How do we produce various verbal reports? Those are ultimately problems about various quasi-behavioral functions, and we can explain those in terms of mechanisms. What's distinctive about the hard problem of conscious experience is it doesn't seem to be that kind of problem. It's not a problem about how it is that the brain does various things or produces various behaviors. Those were the easy problems. It's a problem roughly about how things are experienced, how and why things are experienced or how they feel. And it sure looks like, at least in principle, you can explain all those functions, every behavioral function in the vicinity of consciousness without having answered the question, why is that accompanied by experience? So that's the difference between the hard problem and the easy problems. Of course, there are various strategies for trying to problematize the gap. Dan Dennett's favorite version of this was always to try and turn the hard problem of why we experience various things into the easy problems of explaining why we think and say that we experience various things. That's what I call the meta problem. Dan thought the best way to treat the hard problem is to dissolve it into the meta problem, which we can then try and explain using fairly standard methods. But for people for many people who are realists about consciousness, there's something about the hard problem which is harder than the meta problem of explaining. There's the problem of why we experience these things, which is harder than the problem of why we say we experience these things and can't be collapsed into that problem.
Another reason it can be collapsed is probably the reason why you don't see clearly why it is that I say to understand is that it feels like something to understand. I would add, it feels something to believe. Offline beliefs are like LLM, stuff going on. But if there is a brain process that is causing you to believe something and you're believing it, then you're feeling that you believe it. And so they're the same thing, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting. Online believing, I think of believing as kind of by its nature a dispositional or somewhat offline state. The current thing that happens with feeling isn't exactly so much believing as judging. Judge that the conscious occurrence state is judging that something is the case. Belief is kind of an ongoing offline state, and judging is the online occurrence state, and it may be judging is more obviously conscious than belief.
Well, and just as the Hungarian-German example with with Holger showed that you can have both sides, right? Something that you do understand and that you don't understand. And with beliefs, you have the same thing. There's some things that, do you believe that X? Never mind that it's a judgment. It feels like something to be believing that X, and it doesn't feel like anything. Or it could also feels like something to believe that not X, but it doesn't feel like anything to not be believing X or not X.
Does it feel like something to believe that Paris is in France when that's not sort of currently running through your mind? It's just part of your background.
Offline, when it's offline, it's ChatGPT.
I see. Okay. I guess I think the belief by its nature is offline or dispositional, and when it becomes online, that's judgment. But maybe this is verbal. Maybe you can use the word belief for what happens online.
Other questions from other people, please. We have a captive, Dave Chalmers, here. Come up.
Yeah, I've got a discussion point. I think we've been sort of overlooking the fact that these aren't just text models, they're also reinforcement learningized. You know, they're actually a product of a text model and a reward model. I think that's actually quite relevant to these questions about like if, you know, pleasure and pain, these are related to reward signals in humans. To some extent, you can see every token is generated by the base model and the reward model. And yeah, I don't know. I think this is overlooked in a lot of the discourse on the treating these things as just text models. They're really not anymore.
The reward model is tied to, I mean, to the reinforcement learning aspect specifically, as opposed to the self-supervised.
Well, it's not necessarily, there's methods other than actual, I mean, there's different methods now. There's RLHF, there's DPO, PPO, all these various acronyms. But what it always comes down to is that the probability of any token is the product of the base model probability, just the raw text model, and then some reward model. It's some exponential reward model.
Okay, so the pure language model prior to reinforcement learning isn't going to be subject to this analysis. No reward model there, but the moment you've got RL on top of it, you have
and the reward model is it's modulating the probabilities of tokens on the fly. It also, during the reinforcement process, there's reward signals, positive or negative. And ultimately I think if you want to model human communication, there'd be an equivalent of the reward model, which is like trying to model your interlocutor, and you're trying to get information to your interlocutor. Seems like any well-formed sort of reward model on a language model is going to also go in that direction. And that seems like a whole different thing in terms of like thinking about what the internal states must be.
Yeah, and so the thought might be that it turns out that once you bring in reinforcement learning, maybe this actually brings a whole new class of mental states into the picture that a pure self-supervised language model couldn't have, including affective states like pain and pleasure.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's models of affective states in terms of like it's like your internal estimate of what the reward should be before you've actually received real reward from the environment.
Yeah.
There's like in the moody reinforcement learning where you have a reward estimator that gives you something you can interpret as an emotion. And so, yeah, I think, it's just an overlooked part of the discussion, I think.
No, you're right. And I mean, in general, trying to figure out the computational basis of affect ought to be incredibly important, because after all, so many people think that when it comes to moral status, what really matters is not just consciousness, but affective consciousness, pain, pleasure, suffering, happiness. So from that perspective, it's extremely important to figure out what the computational basis of affective states are. And my sense is the literature on this is surprisingly sparse. I mean, there are a few different models of, computational models of affective states, but there's not a consensus model here. My former graduate student, Rob Long, who's now doing a lot of work on, language model consciousness and sentience, has been done a review of this, and it's surprisingly sparse. And I totally agree that the reward models in reinforcement learning are a very natural place to look for for affective processing. If you take this seriously, yeah, it's interesting. Pure self-supervised models, no affect. They're what we call philosophical Vulcans, maybe perception, cognition, but no positive or negative valence or feeling. Once you start training them with reinforcement learning, that is the place where pain, pleasure, and valence come in. Boy, that's a very interesting speculation if true.
Louis,
Hi, does it work?
it's okay, he hears without it.
Oh, good, okay. My question is a bit on the how to apply the notion of competence to an LLM. I kind of try to get generative LLMs working in I would say industrial context, if you will, where you have like clear applications and you try to have like reliable results, and this is like surprisingly difficult to a point that it becomes very hard to have any confidence in any competence of the model, because sometimes just slight changes in the prompt or slight changes in the context will make that this machine that you thought was competent for some kind of reasoning or inference is no longer competent in that context. And as a result, like there is a sense in which like you were trying to say like, okay, going back to your presentation, does an LLM understand? Is it capable of reasoning? If it's capable of reasoning, then we can draw an inference about understanding. But even just, so even just if you're trying to get the to get an assessment on that front, I get the impression it's very, very difficult, because we're used to looking at competence of humans. So often we'll know what kind of questions, what kind of tests we can do for that. And then from that, we can draw a conclusion about a wider competence. But the experience in LLMs is that very often the contours of this competence are so unusual, so unpredictable, that it's very hard to predict how they're going to behave in slightly different contexts. In that sense, I wonder, what can we say about like is it even the right language to talk about reasoning competence, or is it simply a case of things being very context dependent and well, anyways, the question is, sorry.
Yeah, that is super interesting, and yeah, the remarks based on industrial experience are very useful. I take it the underlying worry is something like the fragility of language model capacities. Maybe they'll work in some context, fairly limited, and then try a slightly different context. You don't get the same kind of useful response, and things go wrong. And then the question is what to say about mental states like reasoning, understanding, belief, whatever, in the presence of fragility. In the case of humans, at least, if someone can do something, say, 25% of the time, and then 75% of the time they can't do it, well, we might say, okay, on the one hand, we'd say, well, they're not very good at it, they're not necessarily an expert, but still they've got some capacity there. The fact that they can actually do it 25% of the time reveals some kind of underlying capacity. If I understand, I'm not terribly good with Hungarian, but I can get, some about a quarter of the time when people say something to me, I know how to respond appropriate. So that suggests some kind of underlying capacity for dealing with or understanding Hungarian. So I guess one way to think about it is, if a language model shows some capacity just some of the time, that already suggests some pretty significant underlying capacity. I mean, again, there's the whole, do you go with the glass half full or do you go with the glass half empty? And I think, if it's a 50% of the time, to get to do something right 50% of the time, you got to have some pretty serious capacities. It's not the full scale capacity of the glass being completely full. I mean, if it does it just, one time in 1,000, you might say, well, it was just pure luck, and it doesn't really suggest an
Okay,
underlying
I'll
capacity.
do the test on you later. Christian Labière has a question. Yeah, you made it when you only spoke once for some time in this, but it was always that one time was extremely good. So I'm glad I was going to ask you even if you didn't raise your hand. Go ahead.
Well, now you've raised the expectations. So I wonder about the sort of ever since ELIZA, we've known the dangers of trying to anthropomorphize our conceptions of these models. You know, as Stefan can mention Hungarian, I was Belgian, whereas the customs officer told me last time I was in Montreal, you are still Belgian. They're very prickly about those things. But, you know, Magritte had that painting of, you know, a pipe saying this is not a pipe, right? This was a representation of the pipe. And those language models, they're representations of the knowledge out there on the web. And I think making the default assumption, like in that case, well, if they can speak 25% Hungarian, let's apply the model of a human who can speak 25% Hungarian and try to extrapolate. I mean, I think that's very dangerous because the default assumption that, well, they exhibit a behavior that looks like us, therefore the internal mechanics must be sort of like us. I think that's that really seems like an unwarranted assumption.
I guess I think that the behavior doesn't guarantee the underlying mental states by any means, but it does at least get us to the point where we should take that hypothesis seriously. Once you see the very impressive behavior that language models exhibit, if it turns out to be, of a kind in various respects with behaviors that human produce, then we have two hypotheses. One is that they actually have some of the relevant underlying mental states and capacities which are driving that behavior. And the other one is no, they're doing it some other totally different way. So yeah, I take it, it sounds like you favor the second kind of hypothesis, perhaps because you think these capacities are merely capacities to represent and describe, and not really to behave. But I don't know, I think as these language models start producing more and more agent-like behavior, which may require things like them to be more embodied than they currently are, and so on, there comes a point where, just say we keep extending them, we have them fully embodied, we have a robot interacting with us in very, very agent-like way. Do you still, at that point, want to say it's a category mistake to think of this being as believing, desiring, and understanding?
Well, so here's an example where I think that sort of projection of, hey, well, if we keep extending, this will happen, which again is really embodies our expectation of what would happen with humans. Here in Pittsburgh, we had the Uber Research Center that was developing autonomous driving. And 6-7 years ago, they were everywhere up here, up and down the east end of Pittsburgh, and they had gotten to the point where they still had human passengers there. As what they told us was just, it's just supervising. The robot is really driving on its own. And then there was a well-publicized accident. And then they took the robots off the road and said, well, we just need to fix a few things. They'll be right back. That was 7 years ago. They haven't been back. And Uber has pretty much abandoned their efforts. And I think the assumption was that, well, if you had a human driver that was exhibiting the considerable competencies that they were exhibiting there, surely fixing those few problems would be a straightforward matter. And it's sort of for a human driver that should be, considering the particular underlying model of how they operate. It turned out, of course, practically speaking, to be very difficult for them to get from that state of competency to the sort of the next state there. So again, whatever that is, and the sort of doing more of the same, a larger training set, more computing power, etc. Certainly in the few years, that's a significant amount of time of future development, it hasn't gotten to the next stage. So the expectations that were at least publicly stated there turned out to be incorrect. And in particular, the sort of the development trajectory in sort of psychological term that would have been expected hasn't projected in the same way as humans. So I've sort of learned from experience that it's dangerous to make those extrapolations, I guess.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And yeah, autonomous vehicle capacities appeared to at least to hit a wall. There was a barrier which they found it very hard to get beyond. And it remains completely possible that language model capacities could hit a wall too. I mean, of course, there are all kinds of limitations right now. There are mistakes, there are things they can't do, and so on. I think we're not yet at the point of knowing that there's a wall there. There are some things that people think are walls. Jan LeCun thinks that, planning is going to be a wall. It's going to require new methods and so on. But I think we're at least not at the point where there's a clear wall that they've hit in the way that autonomous vehicles have hit. On the other hand, you're absolutely right. It's an open possibility there could turn out to be systematic walls and systematic barriers, and some of the things they can't do now will turn out to be things that no system in this class can do. I don't really mean to be taking a position on that. If I had to guess, I'd say we don't have clear evidence, so I would give it at least a good 10 or 20% credence that extensions of current methods might get us to pretty general intelligence. But if it turns out that there is a wall, then what does that mean? If it turns out there are some fundamental capacities these things lack, does that then mean that they can't understand or reason at all? Or does it mean that they do understand and reason some things, but those things are limited? And I think all that will very much depend on the capacity of the wall. But I guess when you're a glass half full person, I don't think of this as being, just keep doing more of the same, and we're sure to get to human level capacities in 10 years. It's more like, hey, there's a serious possibility that this is coming that we're not yet in a position to rule out.
Well, I'm sure it's coming sooner or later. I suspect later, and I suspect with systems sort of considerably augmented and more complex toward the sort of the next word prediction that's now. I don't want to say that can be done. I mean, I think it will be done. It's a matter of enough time and breakthrough. I just don't think it's necessarily of the same sort of straightforward incremental trajectory.
So here's the thing. Back in 2017, I chaired a panel at a meeting on beneficial AI in Asilomar. I chaired a panel which had Demis Hassabis and Jan LeCun and Joshua Bengio and a few of those people were on the panel. And I asked everyone, how many fundamental obstacles do we need to get over to get to how many hills or mountains do we need to get past to get to artificial general intelligence? And the consensus, it's like it's not a well-formed question, of course, but people like Demis were giving answers like, less than 20. And now you hear, that was, of course, before the age of language models. Now you ask that question again in the age of language models, and people say things like, maybe 4 or 5. I think if we're only 4 or 5 mountains away, then that's a whole lot closer than we were 10 years ago. And that's not to say those aren't significant obstacles. And maybe it turns out there are going to be another 10 or 15 mountains to cross. But at least my sense of the timescales is shrunk a lot compared to 10 years ago.
All right. I've promoted a few more people to raise their questions. Go ahead if you've just been promoted.
By the way, are all the questions here by definition for me? I mean, I'm happy to have questions to others as well.
By definition, by happenstance. The trouble is that, Oh, Friedemann, go ahead. Do I have to do anything? This should be allowed to talk and promote to panelists. That should make it possible.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
Hi, I was wondering what we would need to add to, for example, to a reinforcement learning in order to make the reward phenomenal. Earlier came the question that we could concentrate on the reward or punishment, and I wonder, do we have to add something to the functional role in order to get the models to experience phenomenality of that reward or punishment, for example?
People think in the case of humans and non-human animals that there's a difference between nociception and pain and feeling pain. Nociception can happen, involves, processing of negative information and some motivation to avoid and so on. But I think the standard view is that can take place not non-consciously. And that, nociception may be primitive, and maybe some people think at least that nociception can exist in beings without the capacity for consciousness. Then the question is, what is the extra thing that has to be added to nociception to make it experienced as pain? And here there are different hypotheses. One view would be you need some kind of self-monitoring. This is what the higher order theorists say. Pain requires a higher order representation of your nociception. And a less demanding model would be something like, to be conscious, it needs to make it into, say, a global workspace. So a very localized nociception process of reward or punishment will not make it into a global workspace that controls all behavior, so it won't be conscious. But yeah, but the question here kind of does come down to the question of what are the physical or computational correlates of consciousness, which is something we don't understand very well.
Okay, there's several more people. One side remark it has to be made about nociception and pain is that that's a bogus problem. The evidence about the prefrontal lobotomies that were done in the series that they were fashionable was that people that had intractable pain and then were given the right limbic system lesion continued to feel the pain. The only thing that disappeared was that it hurt, which just goes to show that it's not true that all sentience is either positive or negative valence. It can also be neutral, like listening to an oboe or to seeing red. But okay, so that's just a canard I'd like to put. It's like the Walt Disney canard that you've got a lot of unused behavior capacity, brain capacity. Do you want to take it, Friedemann?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to make another attempt to argue that maybe GPTs or some other language models are not as good as they seem. It's indeed, I fully agree that with you that it's that they are they can produce surprisingly high level performance in translating between programs and in completing texts. But on the other hand, completing texts could be just a process like a Markov process where just n grams, k grams have been stored and used in order to make the prediction. And also the translation between programs doesn't strike me as something really over exciting, because it's usually there are symbols in these programs that are unique, and also the indices are very well defined, and one could look up in books and tables how to translate C into Fortran, for example. So if a language model that picks up everything that is available on the internet, then it's not surprising that they also eat and digest those lookup tables and perhaps apply them. But what is on the other hand, as on the negative side, really exciting, for example, in Alessandro Lenci's talk this morning, it became apparent that they really do not show very basic evidence, do not give basic evidence of one would otherwise be inclined to consider knowledge. For example, the question is, does a rabbit have ears? And do ears have rabbits? would likely be both would likely both receive a yes, and without realizing that one without plus the other one is not possible. And so if this is if there's a such a basic fallacy, so to speak, in the system, and this is frequently done in a system. Can we really take it seriously as a cognitive entity? I don't want to speak about consciousness, but it's just is this intelligent behavior? Probably more dumb behavior, I thought.
I just asked ChatGPT, do ears have rabbits? And it said to me, it seems like you might have meant to ask if rabbits have ears. Yes, rabbits have large distinctive ears that they use for hearing and regulating their body temperature.
Well,
if you had a
Professor
different
Lynch,
question in mind, please let me know.
Okay, Professor Lynch's paradigm was such that the question was something like, please judge the truth of the following sentence, and then and then you have the two different sentences as two different inputs, and the answer was restricted to yes or no. That it's of course that if you throw something at it, it might come up with a more frequent sequence.
Okay, this is interesting. I only caught a little bit of that talk. So
yeah,
obviously there are limitations on language models. On the other hand, I'm also impressed by many of the limitations that people point out by a year or two down the line. No longer seem like quite such serious limitations. So yeah, very much an open question.
Okay.
Whether these how systematic current limitations will turn out to be.
Yes. Thank you.
Now, Till, you already asked your question, and Edward, you didn't, right? Or do I have it backwards?
I already asked my question.
So
Thank you.
Till, you didn't ask your question. Till Schütter.
I did ask my question, but yes, thank you.
Oh, both of you asked your questions. Okay.
Yeah, I haven't asked mine yet.
Oh, you have. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so this, Dave, really enjoyed the talk. I find myself not, so I want to say there's something special about human understanding that we don't see in things like large language models. And let's assume that it's not a difference in use on what you're calling use understanding. So we've got, in terms of use understanding, we have, let's assume large language models and humans, same. But I don't like to rest my case on this phenomenal understanding stuff. It doesn't seem to me that what's special about understanding for humans is like a way it feels. I'm not even sure understanding and feels like anything at all in many cases. Now, I don't know how to really put my position without being completely circular question begging. But what I want to say is something like, what's special about human understanding is when I say 2 and 2 is 4, like I know what I mean when I'm saying that. So I'm sort of using the very notion that that's why it's circular. But I want to say that doesn't have anything to do with the way it feels. But that's the special thing. And also my view is that Searle in the Chinese room type case is sort of gesturing at that idea. And I wonder what you'd say about that. Thanks.
You know what you mean. Yeah, it's interesting. And that's not a matter, again, knowledge might be cashed out as some kind of knowledge how ability to use. And looks like language models are okay at that. Might be cashed out as a subjective experience, but you're excluding that. And it's this other thing in the middle that I'm trying to, maybe it's a matter of having the right kind of internal representation or acquaintance with the meaning, but that doesn't involve subjective experience. Is there anything more you can do to flesh out this crucial missing thing?
I'm not sure. I mean, I was sort of asking for some help on this myself, but it's
Give up.
Give
up. It feels like something to know too. You can't get out of it that way.
Well, but I feel like I could I could lose the feeling, take away the phenomenal experience in theory at least, and still have this kind of grasp on the meanings of the things that I'm saying and thinking when I'm saying and thinking them. And I could
David
also
said that was know-how, fine. We're not talking about know-how. We're talking about knowing and believing and understanding.
I can kind of get in the mood like there is this third thing. It's like, yeah, not the know-how, not the experience, but yeah, like there's a third thing, which is like the intentionality or the rationality or something. And then I want to know, well, but yeah, what does that actually come down to? Maybe it's like being subject to rational norms, or somehow you know-how is more primitive and behavioral than that. But I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to pull that. I mean, because consciousness, of course, goes along with those things. But yeah, then you kind of come to the question: could a philosophical zombie have this thing without any capacity for consciousness? Could it nonetheless have the rationality or the intentionality, which nonetheless comes down to something more than good behavioral functioning? And I don't know. Just when I think I've got my got a grasp on the relevant notion, I find it tends to slip out of sight. So I tend to be, roughly there's the functioning and there's the consciousness, and I don't really have a room for the third thing in my ontology. But if you can figure out a way to articulate it, that'll be
Let
fantastic.
the third thing be Anna Strasser. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me to the discussion. So my question is a little bit more technical. So Dave, I'm wondering, why are you so optimistic, in the sense you are optimistic, even you say it's only half full, the glass? And then I'm thinking about LLMs, and I ask myself, which processes in their production are causally responsible for which abilities? So in the beginning, we had only the pure transformers that only experienced unsupervised learning and seemingly produced weakly emergent properties. I think there I would agree with you. Now, there are no more models that are not tweaked by all kinds of reinforcement learning with all the click workers in the global south. And on the top of that, there are hybrid models that have something like constraint checking modules. And I would be very curious to hear whether these newer models benefit from the additional processes in their production, and maybe this is the cause why are you more optimistic than I would have supposed?
I don't think it's the cause. I'm already, I was already glass half full-ish about pure language models. Back in my talk at NeurIPS was 2 days before ChatGPT came out in November 22, and I think of ChatGPT as like as the big public debut of RLHF, reinforcement learning through human feedback on top of these models. So I guess, just historically, I think maybe the glass half full thing is just partly a matter of character or personality, even when, I mean, I tend to focus on the possibilities, even where awful things are concerned. So, there's certainly plenty of room for feminism, but for pessimism. But if it turns out that there's even a 25% chance this is going to result in human level mental capacities, I think that's kind of remarkable. And I focus there. But yeah, it's a really interesting substantive question. What difference all the new things that get added on top, reinforcement learning, prompt engineering, constraint checking, and so on. And I haven't really meant today to be I haven't really focused on any of those things, especially in my analysis so far. The point that came up earlier about reinforcement learning possibly playing a really crucial role in affective processing is really interesting, and not something I've tried to analyze. But yeah, that's an example of a point where where reinforcement learning could, in principle, bring in something totally new tied to reward and motivation. But but if you're asking, are those things playing a role in the optimism of my analysis? Not exactly, but I do intend my analysis to be consistent with there being all kinds of extensions of, my optimism is not that in 10 years' time, pure language models will have these mental capacities, or that in even that, say, multimodal models will have them, but rather that extensions of these models will have them. And that's meant to be, I take it, all the things you're mentioning, I would bring into the class of extensions. But of course, they are, proper analysis would really require getting into the details.
So
Do you think those things make a difference?
I think they make a huge difference, and I think we should have separated discussions about whether pure transformers have understanding, whether pure transformers which have been tweaked by reinforcement learning have understanding, and whether pure transformers with reinforcement learning and constraint checkers like Claude have understanding, because I think the architectures are really different. And then if we're thinking about what makes the systems having certain human-like capacities, we should also look at the architecture. And so I interpret your answer as in the following way. You think that in the future, the pure transformer will not win the game, but you think that pure transformer, which have several maybe kinds of extension in the architecture, which we even cannot conceive of right now, might win the game.
It's just it's more a matter of probabilities than winning and losing. I've got a certain probability that a pure language model, not necessarily a transformer, but a pure language model in an appropriately advanced state might well be conscious at some level, not in a totally human-like way. I mean, probably couldn't be in a human-like way because sensory experience is so central to being a human-like thinker. But yeah, but the more you add, the more you make them multimodal, the more you bring in possible sources of motivation and reward and so on, then the closer you get and the higher the probabilities become. So I guess I think of it more in terms of probabilities than in terms of a binary in or out.
Okay, Alina Gutarieva, and probably this is the last question.
Hey, hi everyone. Thank you for fascinating discussion. So my question is, the development of AI might lead to AI systems that closely intertwined with human consciousness, human activity, that it's extendedly conscious. So AI systems on its own might not be conscious, but when we interact with them, or there are some tasks that we use it, they become conscious because we use them. So these AI systems essentially becoming part of human self. These can be viewed as advanced digital twins for health, education, and other purposes. So what moral issues might arise in these scenarios? And yeah, it would be great to hear the view of David, of course, but also other panelists. Yeah, would be interesting to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Yeah, no, this is super interesting, and it's kind of tied to the question, which I don't know if it was you or somebody else asked in the chat about the degree to which these systems can become part of a human's extended mind, in the sense that, Andy Clark and I described back in the 90s, where a notebook can become part of your extended mind. Your smartphone now, paradigmatically, is part of your extended mind. So much of my memory is now on the phone, and planning, navigation, and so on. I gather that Apple just made their big language model, their big AI announcement today, but I was too busy in this seminar to follow any of the details. But I take it that OpenAI language model technology is now coming to our iPhones, and if these smartphones are already extending our minds, then I take it that already I think very simple autocomplete in a say a smartphone texting system already counts as an extension of our mind. We've got some extended spelling and writing abilities produced through the autocomplete, which might be regarded as capacities of the me plus phone extended systems. Once you've got language models in there, we'll have autocomplete on steroids, and that'll be just a simple case of extending our minds. Likewise, once AI plays a role in search, that will also be be extending our mind. So I take it that what's coming is that, yeah, as we start using, generative AI more and more, it's going to become a very robust and hopefully reliable way of extending our mind, but certainly something that we will rely on, which is one of the conditions for being part of one's extended mind, that a system be reliably coupled to you and one that we rely on for many purposes. Will it extend our consciousness? You did frame your question in terms of consciousness. My view has always been that the tools that extend the mind, like notebooks, smartphones, and so on, don't obviously extend one's consciousness. The basis of consciousness may still be internal. To get to extended consciousness, you may need something that kind of taps in a bit more directly into, say, the neural basis of consciousness. Appropriate brain-computer interfaces, for example, might actually get to the point where the basis of one's consciousness is outside one's head. That said, certainly, relying on AI models could certainly change the contents of one's consciousness, and just as certainly notebooks and smartphones and all the technology we use has greatly enriched the contents of our consciousness. And I fully expect that AI will do that too. Will that make the AI systems themselves conscious? No, all this is actually consistent with the stochastic parrot view, that only the humans are conscious. AI systems extend human consciousness, but are not objects of consciousness in their own right. Of course, if it's possible the AI systems may themselves eventually become conscious, and this opens up the possibility that eventually, we may end up being extensions of the AI system's consciousness. May not be quite as bad as it sounds. I think I'm an extension of my wife's consciousness, and she's an extension of mine, and those things can happen simultaneously. It may well be that human AI relationships eventually, just human AI communication may eventually take that form. But I know you're asking everybody else for their view on this question as well.
Thank you. That's a really interesting answer. And the extension of that we might be the extension of AI, and then that we extension of each other consciousness and so forth. Yeah, thank you. And yeah, the others would be wonderful to hear your views too.
Any other questions, comments, complaints? Yes, Pierre. Question courte.
Hello. Thanks for the really interesting presentation. So a quick follow-up on the last question. If we think of, for example, Susan Schneider, which presented at the beginning of the school, global brain argument, which is kind of dystopian radicalization of this social artifacts enabling us to further develop integration with the devices. So the argument goes just with P1, hyperintelligence is about to come. It's about Nick Bostrom, superintelligence kind of like systems. P2, global brain, we are all part of the global brain, which is a kind of radicalization of the internet and the capacities it enables us to do. And premise 3, the nodes, we are all nodes in this conclusion being we're all part of the global brain and everything becomes integrated socially. So maybe if you want to comment, or anybody on the panel, on the social and political consequences that might happen with the rise of the AI industry. Thank you.
Did you want to know about global brain or about AI industry?
I believe they're connected.
Okay. Anybody? Any takers? Anybody believe in global brain?
I take it this is like extended cognition. This is distributed cognition on steroids.
Yeah,
I mean, there's extended cognition when an AI extends a human mind. There's collective cognition, say when a group of people on a ship are working together. Is the global brain idea that roughly the whole Earth's population can constitute a global mind, and then AI, with AI as part of it as well, or is it
it's kind
AI
of
global mind?
It's a Gaia ganglion consisting of us. Anybody go for it? Yes.
So going back to the problem of extended mind, my question is, I can visualize, I can understand why we talk of extended mind when we're talking of very simple cognitive tasks that we don't process ourselves and we let the smartphone process, for example. But when we have this level of connections where some cognitive processes don't even constitute the equivalent of what we would do, because they are way more elaborated in a way. Wouldn't it be more interesting to look at actor-machine interaction as a form of communication rather than a joint cognitive action of sort?
State, you mean, the joint cognitive state. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think all these are useful ways of looking at it, and merely looking at something as a case of the extended mind, which is like a joint cognitive state, doesn't preclude the possibility of looking at it as a kind of embedded cognition with one mind and a tool, and it doesn't preclude looking at it as a case of distributed cognition with multiple minds. I think all of these perspectives are consistent. Andy and I talked about there being a Necker cube effect. You can flip the cube to see it as a case of extended cognition, but you can flip it back to being embedded cognition or distributed cognition. Actor machine analysis, I guess I think of as a kind of distributed cognition with an actor mind and a machine mind, but it might also be a kind of embedded cognition. So I think all of these are available. And I think you're right that if the extension becomes too sophisticated, if it's far more intelligent than the original being that was being extended, then the extended mind cognition can become something of a stretch. Maybe at a certain point, you want to say that the extension itself is the mind. I mean, the extended mind case works best for quick and easy and automatic processes. Once you've got an AI running the world, then does it really count as an extension of my mind, or do we count as an extension of its? I don't know.
I see no hands. I see no faces asking. Okay, I think this would be a good time to give everybody thank you for your panel contribution and get ready for tomorrow.